So thank you so much for having me. I don't feel like a special guest, but I'll take it. So for those of you who don't know who I am, which is completely fine, please don't know who I am. My name is Emma Twersky, and I am a staff developer relations engineer at Google, but really that just means I get to work on the Angular team, and I get to work on making sure that Angular is the right framework for you, and that you get to impact Angular and make it better. And I really love getting to talk with you, so I'm excited more so to talk during pizza time than to talk right now. And you all got to pick what I talk about, and I'm very thankful that you picked Angular's future roadmap. Not that the other things on here aren't exciting, but Angular v18 is a thing of the past now. It's been out a month, so it's over, it's done. Please update. And open source is great, but we all know and love what open source is. We're all Angular users here, so don't need to talk about that, and AI has enough talks right now. So I'm really excited to talk about what's on the roadmap. And obviously there's only one right answer, which is people say, like, what are you gonna do in 2024? And I can tell you, without a doubt, we will be releasing v19. And that's really all I can tell you, like, for sure. And then in 2025, I can also give a lot of promises here, which is we will be releasing v20 and v21 and some minors in between. And that's because the way Angular releases is time-based. And maybe by now we're used to that, but for a while people were always confused, like, we still get comments, right? Like, every 6 months, another version? Yes, like every 6 months, another version. For now, the way the team has decided to do it is that in order to make sure that for enterprise users, you can always consistently rely on there being a new major version every 6 months, a new minor version every 6 weeks in between, or something like that. And that allows you at your companies and with your enterprise applications to plan and know for your future roadmap when you should be thinking about updating and when new versions will be available. That cadence also allows us to, instead of saying like we, have something like signals and we want to like get it out to you, we know that we have a version 6 months in advance, and we can start to target that version with some of these ideas and be a little bit more thoughtful about like incrementally getting features out to you without having to like bundle a bunch of features in and then like randomly throw out breaking changes. And the other thing to know is that the way we think about our roadmap is very like developer scientific driven, right? We're all like right-brained people in here. We all think analytically about what we're doing. We write code. We want that code to like function and be right. But we also want to think about like why we're doing what we're doing. And so anytime we think about putting something on our roadmap or bringing something to Angular, we first think about what Angular developers want to see. And so we run these annual surveys, and every year around like Q4 or the end of the year, you'll see us like sharing a bunch of places and trying to get as many developers as possible to give us feedback. And that's because we want to know what you want to see in the framework, right? Like, this is your biggest chance to impact our roadmap. So anytime we think about wanting to do something, we look for evidence that it's the right thing to do. And we do that by looking at our annual survey. We also do that by running RFCs. We do that by looking at our GitHub discussions, by our GitHub issues, by our GitHub feature requests. We look for data that either gives us feedback that we're doing the wrong thing and we pivot and switch directions, or we look for feedback that that's something that you want to see. So for example, here we saw that like tooling and productivity were the top things that people felt they had in Angular, but that other things like SSR and testing were things that we needed to come up with better answers for. So when we looked to our future roadmap, we were going to take those into account. So everything you see on a roadmap has evidence-driven data to back up that that's what we think we should be working on right now. And every year when we do another survey, if those numbers change, we will adjust our roadmap. Which is all to say, if it's on our roadmap today, that doesn't mean it'll be on our roadmap tomorrow because your needs might change. The other thing that I like to talk about, has a bunch of caveats for our roadmap, is there's a lot of things that go on the roadmap, and it's sort of hard to think about, like, why would Angular introduce this feature? Why would Angular care about working on this? There's only 30-something people on the team, so we have to be really intentional about the things we pick up, and we want to make sure that they have the maximum value to you as a developer. So I like to think about them in sort of like the 3 Emma buckets, where everything we do with Angular, everything we work on with the roadmap, is an improvement, right? Like, that seems kind of obvious. We shouldn't be doing something if we don't think it improves Angular. But at the baseline, everything is an improvement. These are things like fixing the documentation, bug fixes, bug reports that you open on GitHub, schematics that make it easier to migrate, tooling that makes it easier to build your applications, like incremental little features, right? These are the things people probably don't like tweet about, that don't go viral, because it's like, just like, well, yeah, you had to fix that. Within that, there's a subset of those features that are explorations, right? These like go beyond just being an improvement. So like, yes, it's an improvement, but it's also something sort of exploratory that is cool, that we have on our roadmap, that we might work on, like template authoring, right? Like, that wasn't something that people directly asked for in a bug. Like, it wasn't broken, but we explored how we could better it so that it would be an improvement and an exploration of something better. And then the subset of things on the roadmap that I think people get the most excited about are innovations. So these are still improvements. They still improve the framework. They're still explorations, right? They're still like going beyond that improvement a little bit, but they also innovate. And I think this is where in the last like year, Angular has started to get a lot of traction, because we've started to put more in this innovation bucket of saying like, yes, we can improve the framework incrementally. Yes, we can remain stable. Yes, we can explore some new things, but we can also innovate on the web and participate in pushing the web forward. These are things like a new reactivity system with signals, zoneless, partial hydration, defer, like things that the web doesn't have, or that Angular can bring to the web to make developers' lives easier, but also like push the web forward. And you're going to see sort of 3 labels that people also get confused about, so I want to clarify those. So when we introduce something to Angular, we have 3 sort of buckets of readiness. The first is experimental. This means like these APIs might never become stable. This is an idea we have. We're putting it in the framework. We want you to give us feedback, but we're not promising that we're ever going to go beyond that. Typically, it does go beyond that. Typically, we get good feedback that you like it, but it doesn't have to. And the reason we put it in experimental first is we started to see that, like, if you think back 5 years to like the Angular of the past, we didn't have these labels. And because we were doing things every 6 months, we were really scared to put something in a major release and then be committed to it for 2 versions of support if we didn't know that you liked it. So we started introducing things as experimental with this idea that like, hey, let's put it out there, let's get feedback, and let's see if you like it. Once things are like good and experimental and we get some like good vibes from y'all, we promote it to developer preview. This is like a Angular specific term that we've introduced. And again, it's this idea that like we have a fully functional model. Signals is a good example, but we want to continue to collect feedback. We want to see how you use it. We want to like polish it, stabilize it, write docs, get feedback, add migration schematics, and even more so, like figure out how it fits in the Angular story, right? So signals are still in developer preview, partially out of stability of a few of the APIs, but also because we're still trying to figure out like how to put it into our getting ready docs to make sure that when you have a new developer on your team, we have a good way to tell you how to tell that developer like how to use signals. How are you going to use signals in your application? And then once we have like a good idea, we have a stable, we have a fully functional API, we put it in production ready. And these are the APIs that follow all of the like Angular compatibility, deprecation, support policies that you know and love. This is like the enterprise ready application. And this is what we're like striving to get everything to on our roadmap. So with that, I'm 14 slides in, and I think it's time to actually talk about what's on the roadmap with those terms. And the easiest way to go and refer to all of this is to go to angular.dev/roadmap. Like, cheat code, I like saw the results of this poll, and I was like, this is great. I can just share this page that I wrote on our documentation that shares explicitly what our roadmap is. And that's because for the last 3 years, we've had a public roadmap. And we're really trying to work on transparency so that you all at any point can go to our docs and say, what is the Angular team working on, and see it without having to go to like GitHub and like look up somebody's branch and like sneak peek on what commits our team is pushing, which you can totally do. Like you could know exactly what we're working on every day, but if you want just a summary, we have a really nice one on the web that allows you to see that. And what I want to highlight is we added, like literally 2 weeks ago, a new section to our roadmap to explicitly call out what's ready on our roadmap for you to use today. Because we kept getting this question of like, okay, you're working on a million things, like every version, there's just too much for me to learn. Like, where's the list of things that I can go to like start using in my application? So if you go to the roadmap, there's in scroll 1 section, there's a new section there, and it's called Production Ready. And it has a list of everything we feel is production ready in that version of the docs for you to use today. So today, those things are hydration, deferrable views, built-in control flow, MDC components with Angular Material 3, standalone, NG optimized image, the image directive that was done in collaboration with Chrome, inject, and CDK directives. I'm not going to go through these because these are things on the roadmap that were already delivered, but know that if you want more, you can go to that roadmap page. There's links to these docs, and they meet our idea of production readiness, which means we have a story of how you should be using them. We have clear documentation, and we feel that these are ready for your production applications. The next section is available to experiment with. And so these are experimental and developer preview APIs that we want feedback on. They're in different stages of feedback, but these are things that we have links to documentation or links to experimentation that you can go and start to experiment with if you're excited about this sort of like cutting edge next version of Angular. It's also great because these probably will be production ready, which means if you want to get a head start, if you're like a tech lead, if you're an architect, if you're trying to think about how you might start to incorporate these things, we're giving you a head start by looking at like experimental versions of things. So these are signals, which should be promoted quite soon. Event replay with SSR, which is the JS Action library that we just open sourced in V18. Zoneless, which is our newest V18 introduction of an experimental zoneless change detection. And hydration for I18N blocks. You'll continue to see these lists fluctuate. So again, like please, if you learn nothing else from this talk, head to angular.dev/roadmap. And with that said, let's get to actual things that we're working on for the future. So the first subset of things we're working on is developer velocity. These are things that when we look at that feedback, when we look at how we want to make Angular incrementally better, we think, how do we make you as a developer faster? And right now, our things in that section are signals, which I'm not going to talk about because there's a whole other 2 talks today about signals. Zoneless, which I'm also not going to talk about because there's a whole other talk today on zoneless. And local template variables, which I am going to talk about because nobody mentioned those. So local template variables is like by far the least defined of these 3, right? Like you know what signals are, or you will by the end of today's meetup. You know what zoneless is because it's like experimentally out there. There's like a version of it, and Like, we can agree it'll be good for developer velocity, but there's another talk about that today. Local template variables, there's like nothing out that says we're doing this except our roadmap. And that's because we know we can do it, but we're still figuring out like how we want to do it. So currently the idea is that we have some sort of like @let declaration in templates that allows you to define a variable within your HTML template and then use that value in your template. So here, like I define a name, I use a name. And there's a bunch of like rules about how to define a let declaration, but basically just think like JavaScript in the template. It's not like super exciting, but people really like this. This is a big feature request. We see data that this is something developers want. The big caveat here that I haven't put on this slide is like, we are actively in discussions in the team about how to make this ergonomic for developers and how this fits into the larger story of how we're making Angular better. So you've seen over the last couple versions that we've slowly started to iterate on what Angular templates look like. And there's a lot of thoughts about the Angular component authoring format and Angular authoring in general. And we realized that while this is on our roadmap and this is something we want to look at doing, we're taking a step back from this and taking a look at the larger authoring format of Angular to decide like how this fits into that. So again, this is something that you might see in a minor, but also we're like thinking more about the like larger authoring story, which I'll talk about later. The next section is Angular material and the CDK. So officially, the things that the material team are thinking about talking and working on are CDK primitives and component accessibility. So if you use Angular material today, you know that Angular material just went through this like large migration within Google to update to the new design format of Angular Material 3, which is a Google design library. And we've slowly, as we've been doing that, working on MDC component migration, improving accessibility, like doing a bunch of work on those components. The Angular component team is now interested in taking a step back from those components and thinking more broadly about the fact that like what they've really delivered is like a great example of enterprise components at scale. So we have all these different customers, like I go to meetups and talk to all of you. You all have your component libraries like internally at your own like work, right? We know that. And Google has its own version. And for the last couple versions, the Angular component team have been really focused on updating the Google version and the like open source version of those components. But what they think they can do even better is distill the interactions of those components into like a set of primitives that you all could reuse. So even if your components don't look like ours, at the core, there's like only so many interactions, right? Like clicking on a button, opening a menu, scrolling on a list, like list box, combo box, all these things. So we know we have a list of interactions that we handle in components already. And we handle them accessibly, we handle them at scale, we handle them across thousands of like million user applications at Google, and we know we do those really well. So instead of delivering you just the end components that you have to take and then like overwrite the entire DOM structure of to like fix the H1 to make sure it like looks good, we think the next version of components could be that this team wants to explore CDK primitives that again distill all of these interactions and more into something like that. And this is somewhere where I'd love to talk at the break, but if you have ideas of CDK primitives you would use and consume, or that your enterprise would consume, we would be really interested in hearing and getting feedback. Because again, this is sort of like a future roadmap idea of what that team is looking at and wants to do. The next section is the tooling team. And very broadly, they want to improve tooling. But more specifically, they're looking at modernizing unit testing with ng-test and streamlining language service support. They're doing a bunch of other stuff too that sort of goes across other parts of the roadmap. But in these sections, right now, we get a lot of questions about ng-test, and so on the roadmap, they are looking at starting by existing Karma implementations with Web Test Runner, and then looking at the array of options and figuring out what the best browser-based unit testing support would look like that allows both browser and node testing. Right now, they have chosen this route on the roadmap because it's a relatively low friction change, so this really shouldn't affect you. But know that they understand that they get a lot of test questions because tooling and testing go hand in hand. And so on their roadmap is maybe not necessarily a code implementation change, but figuring out a testing story that makes sense. The other thing is, along with all of these new production-ready APIs, the tooling team supports the language service, and not on here, but they also support Angular DevTools, and they work with Chrome to also support DevTools within Chrome DevTools. And so one of the things they're working on is streamlining standalone imports in language service, but also more broadly looking at, with all of these new production-ready APIs, with hydration, with zone lists, with authoring format changes, with control flow, making sure that the language service and DevTools and Chrome DevTools have good debugging and tooling stories to support those new production-ready APIs. The next section is fast by default. So this may get a little bit confusing with developer velocity, but when we think about fast by default, we think about the fact that back in the day, we always thought of Angular as a batteries included framework, right? It came with a bunch of stuff out of the box. So yes, we want to make it faster for you and your developer velocity to build Angular applications and write the physical code. But we also think that the approach for Angular going forward is to make sure that Angular is fast by default, that the framework out of the box delivers you the best practices to write applications that are performant, and to build those best practices into the actual framework. And one of the things that we used to do here is, for example, we had a lot of magic in Angular that tried to make it performant for you. And we're starting to think about how we can continue that idea of having the right amount of magic in Angular to make it performant, to make it fast by default, but also give you the ergonomic controls to write fast applications. So in this section is an exploration of partial hydration. You may have seen, if you watched the ng-conf demo or keynote, but there was a demo in that of what partial hydration might look like. Event replay with SSR, which is something that's already out in production in V18, and we're currently working on the SSR and pre-rendering story. And then server route configuration, which is something I don't think we've publicly super talked about. So exploration of partial hydration is this idea that we already delivered on hydration. This is something that developers are asking for, that you're talking about a lot. And we know that we have more work to do in that space. There's concepts like streaming, SSR, partial hydration, all of these different terms. And we want to make sure that Angular has a good hydration story collectively across all of those different topics. And the end goal of this mission is to explore and make sure that developers are able to server-side render content within defer blocks when desirable. So your code might look something like this, where you have a defer trigger that relies on existing trigger conditions to start hydration. And in certain conditions, you may want to require a different hydration condition. So with that, we would provide something like a hydrate on and a hydrate when that describe those hydration conditions. And then in the defer block, use syntax to render the main content on the server, but also hydrate trigger conditions within that block on a per block basis. So essentially introducing something like a partial hydration or something you might have seen across the web that would be considered partial hydration. Right now, partial hydration isn't defined super well, so one of the things this team is doing is figuring out what partial hydration looks like across frameworks on the web and figure out what it should behave like. And this is probably the next RFC you will see from the Angular team or a request for comment on GitHub that provides a prototype of what we're thinking about when we think about partial hydration, so that we can outline where we're headed with this project a little bit better. But this is definitely more in the like prototyping RFC, like can deliver something phase than the exploration phase, which is really cool. The next thing is event replay with SSR. So this is something that's already experimental in V18, but the idea is that during server-side rendering, we can emit JS action attributes to capture events, and then use that JS action library to replay events after hydration. So again, this sort of is more so about the hydration thing I just talked about. And then finally, server route configuration. And I think this one's really exciting because we haven't really talked about this yet, but the router library team is really excited about how we can give you as users a way to configure your route configurations and options to handle things like SSG, SSR, CSR, like all of these different ways that you might want to handle and configure different routes directly in your route definition. We think we could expand this to things like additional response headers, response status code for redirects, ISR, SWR, like there's a bunch of things here, but basically think about if you could define your routes and your paths and then the mode that you want to render those in. And so along with server-side rendering, along with hydration, along with pre-rendering, along with explorations and streaming, thinking about how you actually define your routes to handle all of these different conditions. And so I think this is a really cool byproduct of some of these other explorations that we haven't really talked about that sort of fits in like the tooling developer velocity section. And then finally, we have sort of the catch-all of future work and explorations. So these are things that the team is prototyping, that we're thinking about working on, that like might happen, that people are working on that don't fit into one of these other things. And these are more signal debugging tools and dev tools, HMR, like actual HMR, streaming with SSR, authoring format improvements, two-dimensional drag and drop in the CDK, and Nitro support. And we've sort of touched on how these fit into some of the other things already. But for example, signal debugging and dev tools is part of that like tooling improvement that we already talked about, right? We want to make sure that there's good debugging stories for these things we're delivering. HMR. There is a screenshot of like a really long explanation by our tooling team on the fact that like we know that currently the HMR flag in the CLI doesn't really do HMR, or it does. It does HMR. But we know we can deliver a better hot module reload story. And we know that under that same flag, like ergonomically, we can fix things about the like CLI and how the tooling like configures HMR to actually do HMR. So if you're interested, go to the roadmap, click on this, and you can read a really long GitHub issue of how we want to fix it, essentially, if we can prioritize time to do it. The next thing is streaming server-side rendering. So with HTTP streaming, Angular could respond to a request by returning chunks of HTML where each chunk contains HTML info about a part of the application that it either does not depend on in any async work or the part of the async work that's already been completed, right? And so we have prototypes already of what streaming server-side rendering might look like. For example, in this code snippet, this is a demonstration of how a component level primitive could look like, where in this example, we inject a class called async_ref, which exposes a function that is called when some async work has started. So here the async_ref.blocked is making that reference. And that's exposing a function that is called when some async work has already started. And then once that work is completed, we use handle.resolve to resolve and notify Angular that that work has been completed. Streaming is, again, sort of part of this like partial hydration SSR story that we're thinking about. And so in addition to the developer preview and RFC that we hope to provide of partial hydration, we want to consider and make sure that that story can be taken one step forward, and we can at least think about if Angular could have a streaming story, so exploring that space. And then I already talked about it, but it's worth saying, like, in that like local template variable section, I talked about the fact that we want to investigate authoring formats further. So currently, like, your application might look like this. Like, component selectors introduce a lot of complexity, and we know that, and we get feedback about that occasionally. And it's something that we feel has started to introduce friction, especially as we start to innovate faster and add more things. Like, now you have to say that it's standalone true. Now you have to like add your imports because it's a standalone component. Now you have to, right, like there's a bunch of stuff that's getting added to this. And so we've already shared this publicly, but we're thinking about ways that you could simplify this. And this is like completely just an idea right now. Like, this is totally fake code. This is not Angular that would work today. But what if you could remove, like you directly reference in a template a symbol from JavaScript, so you could just refer to like your Zippy component by Zippy without having to import it? What if you didn't have to specify that it was standalone because you had standalone true by default? What if you like didn't have to import things because it automatically had reference to those things in your component? These are all things that we know we probably could do with JavaScript and TypeScript. But again, similar to that like @let template declaration, we have more investigation to do on making sure that we go in a direction that Angular developers agree, or at least like understand would be the right direction for Angular to go. So this is an investigation because we're in the space where we want to do a lot of research. We want to like do user research. We want to go talk to developers, and we're starting to, like today, introduce this as an idea to you so that you start to give us feedback on what you might want in this space. Or maybe there's things we're not even thinking about, right? Like, maybe you really want to like get rid of having @component and like decorators. I don't know what that looks like for pipes, but again, doing UX, like doing research, starting to talk to developers and investigate improving the authoring format so that we can continue to iterate fast on all of these other things without just like having a 100-line component decorator of like a bunch of feature flags. And then finally, as I was making the slides for this, my manager like opened a PR to introduce another thing to the roadmap, which is evaluating Nitro support in the CLI. So the CLI has taken notice that Nitro is something that is growing community adoption. And so we added this to our roadmap. And frankly, like, I don't know anything about it because we haven't even started to think about it. It's just something that we want to look at. And already got a bunch of traction on Twitter. And this is like evaluating if we can provide Nitro support in the CLI and have the tooling team look at it. So if we think back to those buckets of like improvements, explorations, innovations, they're all kind of one and the same, but these are all the different things that we're looking at bringing to Angular in these different incremental ways, as experimental, as developer preview, as production ready. And when in doubt, go to angular.dev/roadmap to read all of the documentation and ask questions, talk to us on Twitter, talk to us in GitHub issues, give us feedback on this roadmap, give us feedback on RFCs. Engage in these, please. But yeah, thank you so much.